The concept of divine justice refers to the belief that there exists a higher moral authority, often understood as God, that ultimately ensures fairness and accountability in the universe. According to this idea, no action, whether good or evil, remains without consequence forever. Human societies create laws and systems of justice to regulate behavior, but these systems are imperfect. Governments can be biased, powerful individuals may escape punishment, and political interests can distort truth. Because of these limitations, many religious and philosophical traditions teach that divine justice exists beyond human control. It represents a universal moral order where every action is measured against ethical standards established by a higher power. In this view, injustice might prevail temporarily, but it cannot remain dominant indefinitely because divine justice eventually restores balance. In religious teachings, divine justice is closely connected with the idea that the universe is not chaotic but guided by wisdom and moral purpose. Good deeds such as kindness, sacrifice, and honesty ultimately bring reward, while oppression, cruelty, and aggression bring consequences. However, these consequences do not always appear immediately. Sometimes injustice continues for years or even decades before its effects become visible. That delay often leads people to question whether justice truly exists. Yet believers in divine justice argue that time itself is part of the process. Just as seeds take time to grow into trees, actions gradually produce outcomes that shape societies and nations. Throughout history, the idea of divine justice has been used to explain major events. Empires that once seemed invincible have collapsed after periods of arrogance, corruption, or oppression. Powerful rulers who ignored moral responsibilities often faced downfall through rebellion, economic collapse, or internal conflict. Observers frequently interpret these moments as examples of divine justice working through historical circumstances. This does not necessarily mean that supernatural intervention occurs directly in every event, rather, it suggests that moral consequences naturally unfold in the course of history. In modern times, the concept of divine justice still influences how people interpret global conflicts and political crises. When wars break out or when nations struggle for power, many individuals view the situation through a moral or spiritual lens. They ask whether the actions of governments align with justice, fairness, and respect for human life. If a powerful country uses its strength to dominate weaker societies, some observers believe divine justice will eventually challenge that dominance. Conversely, if a nation defends itself or protects innocent people, supporters may see that as part of a just moral struggle. Therefore, the title, divine justice, does not simply describe punishment or reward in a simplistic sense. Instead, it expresses a deep philosophical belief that the universe contains a moral structure where actions have consequences beyond immediate political outcomes. Even when human courts fail and political power distorts truth, the principle of divine justice reminds people that ethical responsibility ultimately transcends temporary power. In the long run, nations and individuals are judged not only by their strength but also by the moral choices they make in moments of conflict and crisis. When examining the current conflict between the United States and Iran, many people interpret events through the lens of divine justice, especially in regions where religion and moral philosophy strongly influence political thinking. The confrontation between these two nations represents more than a simple military struggle, it reflects deeper tensions involving power, security, ideology, and regional influence in the Middle East. When military strikes, retaliatory attacks, and political statements dominate global headlines, observers often ask whether the actions of powerful nations align with moral principles or whether they represent examples of power being used without restraint. In such circumstances, the idea of divine justice becomes a way for people to interpret the unfolding events. Supporters of Iran often frame the conflict as a struggle between a powerful global superpower and a nation resisting external pressure. From this perspective, acts of resistance are sometimes portrayed as a defense of sovereignty and dignity. Those who adopt this viewpoint may argue that if a stronger country attempts to impose its will through military force, divine justice will eventually ensure consequences for that aggression. They believe that history has repeatedly shown how powerful states can face unexpected setbacks when they underestimate the determination of smaller nations. Economic difficulties, political divisions, or international criticism may gradually weaken the position of the stronger power, which supporters interpret as part of a larger moral balance. On the other hand, supporters of the United States and its allies often present a very different interpretation. They argue that military action may be necessary to prevent threats such as nuclear proliferation, regional instability, or attacks against allied countries. From this perspective, intervention is framed as a defensive or preventive measure designed to protect global security. People who hold this view may also connect their arguments to moral language, claiming that confronting perceived threats is itself an act of justice. Thus, both sides of the conflict sometimes invoke ideas related to justice, morality, and responsibility to justify their actions. However, when examined from a broader humanitarian perspective, the concept of divine justice raises deeper questions about the consequences of war itself. Conflicts between powerful states rarely remain limited to military targets. Instead, they often lead to economic crises, disruptions in energy supplies, rising global prices, and suffering among civilians who have little control over political decisions. Families may lose homes, communities may experience fear and uncertainty, and young generations grow up surrounded by tension rather than peace. These human consequences remind observers that war carries moral costs far beyond strategic calculations. In this sense, interpreting the U.S.-Iran conflict through the idea of divine justice does not necessarily mean declaring one side completely right or wrong. Rather, it encourages reflection about whether humanity has learned from past conflicts. If nations continue to rely on military confrontation as the primary solution to political disagreements, the cycle of violence may repeat itself. For many thinkers, divine justice may ultimately manifest not through the victory of one nation over another but through the gradual realization that lasting peace requires dialogue, restraint, and respect for human dignity. From a deeper philosophical perspective, the title, Divine Justice, invites reflection on the broader moral lessons that emerge from conflicts such as the confrontation between the United States and Iran. Philosophers and historians have long debated whether war can ever produce genuine justice. While governments often justify military actions in the name of national security or moral responsibility, the outcomes of wars frequently reveal a far more complex reality. The destruction of infrastructure, the displacement of civilians, and the long-term psychological trauma experienced by populations demonstrate that the consequences of war extend far beyond the battlefield. In this context, divine justice becomes less about determining which side wins and more about understanding the ethical implications of human decisions. Philosophical discussions about justice often emphasize the importance of balance, responsibility, and respect for human life. Justice requires not only protecting one's own interests but also recognizing the rights and dignity of others. When nations pursue power without considering these principles, the results can lead to instability and suffering that eventually affect everyone involved. History provides many examples in which conflicts that initially appeared to benefit one side ultimately created problems that lasted for generations. Economic burdens, social divisions, and international distrust often remain long after the fighting stops. The idea of divine justice suggests that such outcomes are not accidental but reflect deeper moral consequences of human behavior. If leaders make decisions based solely on strategic advantage or political ambition, they may overlook the ethical dimensions of their actions. Over time, those decisions can create cycles of resentment and retaliation that destabilize entire regions. From this perspective, divine justice does not require miraculous intervention. Instead, it operates through the natural unfolding of cause and effect, where injustice eventually produces conditions that challenge the very systems that created it. Another important philosophical aspect of divine justice is humility. Human beings often believe they can control history through power, technology, or military strength. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates the limits of such control. Unexpected events, economic pressures, or shifts in public opinion can alter the direction of global politics in ways that leaders never anticipated. When societies witness these sudden changes, many people interpret them as reminders that human authority is ultimately limited. The concept of divine justice symbolizes this limitation by suggesting that a higher moral order exists beyond human calculation. Therefore, in relation to the current U.S.-Iran conflict, the title, Divine Justice, serves as a reminder that political struggles should not be judged only by immediate victories or defeats. The deeper question is whether the actions taken during times of conflict contribute to long-term justice, peace, and stability. If leaders prioritize dialogue, restraint, and compassion, they may help create conditions that align with moral principles. But if they rely solely on power and confrontation, the consequences may eventually reveal the cost of ignoring those principles. In this way, divine justice becomes a philosophical lens through which humanity can examine its choices and learn from the tragedies of war.